like to welcome you to the Oracle Outlook for the week starting August the 27th, 2018. Before getting into this week's reading, I first want to start off by thanking those of you who took the time and gave me the gift of your time by watching last week's Oracle Outlook. I was pleasantly surprised to see that this video has become one of my more watched videos in terms of number of views. It also got a number of likes, and it was one of the videos that received the most engagement. So I enjoyed dialoguing with those of you who took the time to leave comments. So again, I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. I do appreciate it. So, one of the other things that I wanted to share in regards to last week's video is that just as I am relaying messages to you about what the cards are saying to me in the moment, there are also messages for me being the reader, right? Because I'm part of the collective experience, right? So one of the messages that was relevant for me over the course of the last week was the one where I had talked about this idea about life is always speaking to us, but are we paying attention and to notice the signs that life is sending our way? So for me, it showed up like this. Some time ago, I'd like to say at least a year, maybe a little bit more, I had posted 2 Kipper-related videos. So for those of you who may not be aware of what Kipper is another divination system. So I had, at that time, I was really getting on board with Kipper, and I was contemplating about how much of that I wanted to share on my YouTube channel. So I had posted, a couple of videos. One was about how I read a Kipper Grand Tableau, and the other one was actually about a particular spread called the cross spread that I had discovered in one of my Kipper-related resources, so I wanted to share that. And actually both of those were viewer-requested videos. So over the course of the last week, I started getting a number of comments about those 2 particular videos. So I was, that's very interesting, because I hadn't actually worked with Kipper in a while. Actually, put my 2 Kipper decks on the shelf because I had gotten immersed in Lenormand and gotten really immersed in the Gypsy Witch cards, and I had gotten reacquainted with playing cards, so I was in that space, and so I kind of put the Kipper cards to one side. So I thought this was very interesting that these 2 videos were starting to get a lot of comments coming my way at this particular time. To top it off, as if that wasn't enough, then I got an email from a young woman who had seen some of the Kipper-related videos that I'm mentioning, and she asked me if I would be willing to work with her in terms of cartomancy coaching. That is one of the services that I offer, but my services are tailored to Tarot and Lenormand because those are the 2 systems that I work with the most when it comes to personal clients and students. So on my website, the page is set up where it only talks about Tarot and Lenormand. Do you know what happened? When she sent me that request about wanting cartomancy coaching, she specifically asked for Kipper. Kipper is nowhere on my site, which I found very interesting. And it got me to thinking, is life, the universe, trying to speak to me in this moment and asking me to get back into Kipper? It was almost like the Kippergeist, which is what I refer to the energy of Kipper. The Kippergeist was saying, James, it's time. So I took that to heart. So I've been working with Kipper with my new student and getting myself reacquainted with the cards and getting myself re-immersed in the system, that kind of thing. So it was very interesting. But that is how life spoke to me this week, and I was paying attention. As a result of that, I felt inclined to work with the Kipper for this week's Oracle Outlook. So that is the system that I'm working with this week, specifically the deck of choice, because I only have 2 right now. So the deck of choice is the Fin de Siècle Kipper cards. They are by Ciro Marchetti, and it is now a mass market version that is published by US Game Systems Incorporated. The deck that I have was the first edition, which was self-published by Ciro, and I love it because I have it monogrammed with my name on the backs of the cards. So it's the only deck I have in my collection that actually has my name on it. So it has some special significance to me because of that. And I will say this, out of all of Ciro's decks, this is the one that I love working with the most. So again, we are working with the Fin de Siècle Kipper cards by Ciro Marchetti, published by US Game Systems Incorporated. So I have the deck on hand. I'm going to take a few moments to shuffle the cards. And as I shuffle, I'm focusing on my usual intention and question for these weekly general readings. And that is, what do we need to know for the week ahead? One of the other things that I love about this deck, besides the artwork, is I love how it shuffles. So I'm feeling that'll be great, and now I'm going to go ahead and cut the cards. And fan the cards out. And now I'm going to be picking 5 to work with, because I read Kipper the same way I work with Lenormand, in that I use a line of 5 typically. So that's 4, and now we're looking for the final card. And I'm liking this one, so I'll pick this one. All right, so that is, all the cards have been selected, so now I'm taking the remainder of the deck, and I'm going to put that to one side. So now I have the 5 cards face down in front of me. And what I love about Kipper, Kipper for me is different than Lenormand in this regard. For me, Kipper is like an unfolding story. So when I work with a line of 5, I actually call it like a storyline. So the story in the cards will be unfolding with each card. And I always start with the middle card, and I read it the same way that I read Lenormand. But given the idea that there's a story unfolding in the cards, I tend to look at this card as like the heart of the story. So taking a look at this card, we have, so here we have Courtship. So Courtship, as the center card, or the heart of the story, if you will, is a card that can talk about this idea of getting together. This is a card of social, being social, and social activity. So for some of us, we may be more inclined to focus on, activities that involve other people. This could be about meetings, get-togethers, social events, things of that nature. It's a collective kind of card where we talk about groups of people, that kind of thing. So some of us may be focusing more this week on what can we do with our social relationships this week. This is a social relationship card, so we may be thinking about social relationships. Going with the idea that this card is actually named Courtship, for some of us, we may be focusing on maybe a newly established relationship. And it's in that phase where we are taking the time to get to know the other person better, right? So with the idea of courtship, this could actually be a relationship in which we are dating. I'm going with the idea that courtship is like a dating kind of ritual kind of thing. So this idea about courting people, wooing people, dating people, all with the idea that all of those things help us get to know the other person better, right? So it's about this idea about forming relationships, maybe meeting people for the first time, all within the context of taking the time to get to know other people better. So that is the energy of courtship. Now, courtship in Kipper is what we call a connecting card. So it's very interesting that it's in the middle of the line, because the 2 cards on either side of it are going to be the cards that courtship is trying to connect, right? And as I'm saying the word connect, going with the idea that this is a connector card, this is all about connections this week. Forming connections, forming bonds with other people. It may be through the lens or through the context of social engagement or social activity. But it's really all about connections, right? How can we connect with other people? Maybe people that we don't know all that well this week, but it's all about forming connections, right? But it'd be very interesting to see what the cards are on each side of this, going with the idea that this is a connector card. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to see how the story this week unfolds. So taking a look at the first card, okay. So this is interesting. So here we have imprisonment, which is known as prison in traditional Kipper cartomancy. So the prison card is, or imprisonment, is all about blocks, right? So this is about maybe taking a look at what is blocking us in terms of forming connections or bonds with other people, right? This card can represent this idea as like if we're moving down the storyline and in the focus of it we're becoming more social or we're engaging in social activity, then imprisonment as the first card starting off is this idea about maybe being in confinement. I look at the image and I think of solitary confinement. So this could just be a matter of, being on one's own, being in solitude, things of that nature, right? And that could be self-imposed, or that could be some sort of imposition by other people, right? But either way, imprisonment is all about the ways that maybe we limit ourselves, we restrict ourselves, we kind of hold ourselves back, that kind of thing. But I'm going to look at this as this idea of, confinement and being in solitude, right? So it may be coming out of that. For some people, it may be you're being encouraged to work with whatever blocks that you have when it comes to forming connections or bonds with other people, or this idea about maybe even being social. This card may suggest that you kind of maybe want to keep yourself locked away, and if you're wanting to become more social, then you're being asked to consider what it is that you get out of keeping yourself locked away, right? Because that is forming a block or a limitation or restriction around getting to know other people better. And it also robs other people of getting the opportunity to know you better, right? So I'm seeing that with imprisonment. So now let's look at the card in between imprisonment and courtship. Now remember, keeping the idea that this is one side of the connection with the courtship card. Here we go. Okay. So here we have concern. So concern is a card that talks about taking a look at our thinking, right? This is a card about the mind, right? So this usually represents confusion, uncertainty, doubt. So it's about exploring that. And one of the things that Kipper is very heavily reliant on direction. So it's very interesting. On the image of the card, we have a man who's actually sitting in a chair, and he's facing the imprisonment card, right? So this is, if we go with the idea that the focus is on forming a bond, forming a connection, getting to know other people better, being more social, engaging in social activity, then with this card facing the imprisonment card, there may be some concern about confinement, solitude. There may be some negative thinking that results in confinement, solitude, locking ourselves away in whatever shape, form, or fashion that takes. But with these two cards, we're being asked to take a look at that. How is our thinking in terms of negativity or being pessimistic having this kind of effect? Because in this regard, the concern card is known as a cause and effect card. So wherever the gentleman is on the card, whatever direction he's facing is the effect. This is what's being affected, right? And then the card behind it is what is causing that. So there may be some people who are really being encouraged this week to take a look at their level of engagement with people. There may have been a certain type of relationship, going with courtship, that has now produced this need for isolation, confinement, restriction, right? And it may be even tapping into this idea that there may be somebody who's got fears about forming new relationships or connecting with other people that you're being asked to work through. So there is that to consider. So now let's take a look at what's on the other side of courtship, because again, there's going to be a connection formed between concern and whatever this card is. So taking a look at the card, okay. So here we have distant horizons. So this is a card for me that can talk about one's hopes, wishes, and dreams, right? So with that, there may be a concern, going with the idea that courtship is connecting these two cards, right? So there's a connection between one's hopes, wishes, and dreams, and this idea about one's thinking about that. So it could be somebody has a hope or wish or a dream or an aspiration to achieve something, but then they have this negative thinking that's kicking in. And if I go further with the story, I'll put the courtship card down, hold these two up. So if we go with the idea here that somebody has a hope, a wish, or a dream, something that they want to see realized, then concern is all about this idea about being pessimistic with that. So we form negative or limited thinking as to why we can't achieve that. You know, some form could be like, oh, I'm too old. Oh, I'm too young. Oh, I'm a woman. Oh, I'm a man. Whatever. I'm a big believer in, if you have any thoughts this week that fall into the line of like, I can't because, pay attention to what comes after because that is a limited thought. It's a limited, restrictive thought. And all it does, it keeps you from not taking any action on whatever this hope, wish, or dream is. So that may be something to offer in terms of guidance. Pay attention to your thinking this week, especially those negative, limiting, restrictive thoughts that you are holding about yourself or about connections that you make this week or about being social. Whatever the case that courtship could mean for you. But again, going with the idea that the theme is about connections, it could also be too like making a connection between your hopes, your dreams, your aspirations, and the thoughts that come up in terms of challenging thoughts around that. But it's making me feel like we're being asked to take a look at what it is that we want to achieve and we believe that we can't this week. Now, there's always a theme, right? Or there's always some kind of recurring message, and it's here again, believe it or not. So I want to make sure I put the cards back in the order that they are showing up. Okay. So with Distant Horizons, this is a card that can also represent one's spiritual life. So again, for another week, we have, for some people, this need to maybe be more aware of their spiritual lives, their spiritual direction, that kind of thing. So again, we're being asked to focus on that. And again, maybe too, I'm seeing this as a possibility. If we're talking about this idea about making a connection with our limited thinking, our restricted thinking, you know, if we're being asked to do that, and I want to make sure I'm holding up the cards in the right order. Right. So if we make a connection between these two things, right, then the idea here with Distant Horizons is how can we rise above that? What I love about the image is that a ship is in the air, right? So this could be a visual metaphor for one's spiritual journey or the journey through your mental landscape or your mental atmosphere, going with the idea that concern talks about our thinking. So the idea is about elevating your thinking, elevating your consciousness, right? Because the ship is high up in the air, right? So it's about going, if we talk real spiritual here, the concern, which is the negative, pessimistic thinking, is on a lower vibrational frequency, right? And then Distant Horizons is about how can you rise above that? How can you rise above that? Elevate your thinking so it's on a different plane of consciousness or at a different vibrational frequency, right? It's all about maybe you find some sort of spiritual resource or spiritual material, and maybe through some kind of introduction with courtship, somebody may introduce you to some kind of new spiritual material, spiritual resource that helps you change your thinking or at least starts the process of helping you elevate your consciousness. So that's what I'm seeing with Distant Horizons. So again, Distant Horizons is about paying attention to our hopes, dreams, aspirations. What is it that we want to achieve? right? For some people, it's again this recurring message about focusing on your spiritual direction, your spiritual path, those kinds of things. But if we go with the idea that I'm more inclined to go with the idea that concern and imprisonment are talking about really paying attention to our negative, pessimistic, limited, and restrictive thinking, then this card is about how can you find ways that are going to enable you to elevate your consciousness, to rise above that level of thinking. So that's distant horizons. So now let's take a look at the final card this week. And here we have, all right. So here we have marriage. So I love this. So marriage is a card that's similar to courtship in that it's another connector card, right? So for me, if we're talking about this idea, going with the story and reading them in the order that they appear. So we just talked about distant horizons, and I talked about this idea about having hopes, dreams, wishes, aspirations, something that we like to see granted or fulfilled in our life, right? So if there is something that fits that bill for you this week, then marriage as a follow-up is asking you to commit to that. Marriage is all about commitments. So this could be actually, for some people, if we go with the idea that courtship can talk about, creating bonds, getting to know other people better, that kind of thing. So it could be as a result of an introduction or taking the time to get to know somebody else better. You put in the time, you've done that. Then you may have the hope or the wish that that relationship, in whatever context it is, that it becomes deeper, that it becomes more of a commitment. It becomes a serious commitment. For some people in particular, if you are dating, courtship, remember I said was about dating too. If you are dating, you may have the hope, the wish, or the dream that that relationship deepens. That relationship becomes more serious in nature. And so if that's the case, then what are you willing to do to make the commitment towards that goal, right? So there's that. But if we talk about goals, just generally speaking, then marriage is asking you to commit to whatever it is that you are hoping, wishing, aspiring to. How can you commit to that? What could you do as a small step towards accomplishing or achieving that goal? This is a life coach coming out in me. So when I work with my clients in terms of a coaching setting, I always encourage them to commit to taking one step. Everything starts with one step, but even before that, it starts with making the decision to take that step. So what could be the one step that you could take that would set you on the path to begin the process of achieving that hope, that wish, that dream, that aspiration? And would you be willing to commit to it? That's the other thing I ask my clients. Once we come up with the step, I ask them, would you be willing to commit to that? Right? Rather than impose that on them, I want them to buy in and make the commitment. If they make the commitment of their own volition, they're more inclined to follow through on it rather than having it imposed on them. At least that's my personal belief as a coach, right? So as your coach this week possibly, what small step would you be willing to take as a sign of commitment, because the universe honors that? If we go with the idea that distance horizons can represent all things spiritual, then the universe supports that. Whatever we set an intention to, whatever we commit to, the universe supports that. So how can you show the universe that when it comes to your wish, your goal, your aspiration, that you are willing to commit to that? Because if you commit to it, the universe will commit to you. Right? So there is that. So I love seeing marriage card at the end. And regardless of whatever the context is, as the last card this week, marriage is just asking us, I always say this generally speaking, whatever commitments that we make this week, that whatever commitments that we choose to make this week, are we willing to honor those commitments? Are we willing to keep our promises? Especially when other people are involved, right? There could be a commitment to another person made this week, commitment to a group of people made this week. There could be a commitment to attend a social event, those kinds of things. But whatever the commitment is, would you be willing to honor it? If you make a promise this week, would you be willing to keep it? because marriage is a ceremony where we make vows, pledges, promises, all those things. So what would you be willing to do to make sure that you are able to keep your promises and to honor your commitments this week, especially if you're going to be hit with limited, restrictive thinking, or having doubt or uncertainty about being able to do that, right? So it could just be moving through the challenges this week, where if you make promises to other people, things may show up in life. You know, life happens, so things may show up, and you may think, oh, I'm not going to be able to do that. But ask yourself the question, is that really true? Or is there another choice or option you can make that would allow you to still honor that? So that's what I'm seeing with the cards this week overall. So on this note, or on that note, I will go ahead and end this week's Oracle Outlook. I'm James Himm Mitchell, and I'd like to thank you for sharing space here with me for this week's reading. And I look forward to sharing the same space with you again in our next video reading together. So until then, I'm hoping that you have a wonderful day, and I'm hoping that you have a wonderfully social week. Take care.